The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as I sat at the same oak table where Martha and I had shared 37 years of breakfast conversations. The newspaper lay folded beside my coffee cup, its headlines as distant to me as the moon. At 73, I'd grown accustomed to the quiet that filled our house, a silence that had once been companionable but now felt hollow, like an echo waiting for a voice that would never come. Outside, the garage stood as it always had, its weathered doors slightly ajar. From where I sat, I could see the corner of my old workbench, still cluttered with tools I hadn't touched since Martha passed. She used to joke that I kept more memories in that garage than most people kept in photo albums. She wasn't wrong. Every rusted wrench, every coffee-stained blueprint, every half-finished project told a story of our life together. There was the wooden toy chest I'd built for Sarah when she was 5, its lid decorated with hand-painted butterflies that Martha had insisted on adding. "Every little girl needs butterflies," she'd said, her brush dancing across the pine's surface with the same gentle precision she brought to everything she touched. Sarah had loved that chest, filling it with dolls and picture books and all the treasures that matter to a child's heart. Then there was the go-kart I'd constructed for Michael's 8th birthday, a sleek red machine that had been the envy of every kid on Maple Street. Michael had raced it down our driveway with the fearless abandon that only children possess, his laughter echoing off the garage walls as Martha and I watched from the porch, our hearts swelling with the simple joy of making our son happy. Both my children were grown now, of course. Michael, 42, lived in the city with his perfectly manicured life, the corner office, the luxury sedan, the downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the financial district. He visited twice a year, usually around the holidays, arriving in expensive suits that made him look successful and distant in equal measure. He'd sit in our living room, checking his phone while Martha fussed over him, making his favorite pot roast, and pretending not to notice when he barely touched it. "Dad, you really should consider selling this place," he'd say, gesturing vaguely at the house that had sheltered him for the first 18 years of his life. "The market's good right now. You could get a nice apartment in one of those senior communities. Everything would be taken care of for you." Martha would catch my eye across the room, and I'd see that familiar mixture of hurt and resignation in her expression. She'd never said it aloud, but I knew she felt the same growing distance I did, the sense that our son was slipping away from us, trading the warmth of family for the cold comfort of material success. Sarah had been different. Where Michael was sharp edges and calculated moves, Sarah was soft curves and intuitive grace. She'd inherited Martha's gift for seeing the best in people, for making everyone around her feel valued and heard. Even as an adult, she'd call every Sunday evening, her voice bright with stories about her students she taught 3rd grade at the elementary school downtown, or her latest volunteer project at the animal shelter. "I found the most beautiful stray cat yesterday," she'd tell us, her excitement bubbling through the phone line. "Tabby with the most gorgeous green eyes. Mrs. Henderson from down the street is going to adopt her. I just know they'll be perfect together." Sarah had never married, never had children of her own, but she seemed to have endless love for everyone else's. She was the aunt who remembered every birthday, who showed up to every school play and soccer game. Michael's children, though he lived states away, adored their Aunt Sarah with a devotion that sometimes made me wonder if she understood them better than their own father did. The lake stretched out beyond our backyard, its surface mirror smooth in the early morning calm. Martha and I used to take the old rowboat out there every evening after dinner, gliding across the water while the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She'd sit in the stern, her hand trailing in the cool water, while I worked the oars with the steady rhythm I'd perfected over decades of shared sunsets. "Remember when the kids were little?" she'd say, her voice soft with nostalgia. "Sarah used to insist on wearing her life jacket even in the shallow end, and Michael, Lord, that boy would have tried to swim to the other side if we'd let him." I remembered. Michael had been fearless to the point of recklessness, always pushing boundaries, always convinced that rules were suggestions that didn't apply to him. Sarah had been cautious but curious, asking endless questions about the fish beneath the boat and the birds that skimmed the water's surface. Even then, I'd seen the fundamental difference between them. Michael took what he wanted, while Sarah gave what she could. The house had been too quiet since Martha died 18 months ago. Cancer, swift and merciless, had taken her from us in the space of 6 months. Sarah had been there through all of it, holding Martha's hand through the chemo sessions, organizing the medications, sleeping on the uncomfortable hospital chair during those final weeks. Michael had visited twice, once when we got the diagnosis and once for the funeral. Both times he'd seemed impatient, checking his watch, taking calls from the office even while we sat in the oncologist's waiting room. "I wish I could stay longer, Dad," he'd said after the service, his hand already on his car door handle. "But I've got this huge presentation on Monday. You understand?" I'd nodded because what else could I do? But Sarah had understood the weight of that silence, had seen the way his absence carved holes in Martha's final days. She never said anything. Sarah was too kind to criticize her brother openly. But I caught the flicker of disappointment in her eyes when another Sunday passed without a call from Michael. Another holiday arrived without his presence. After Martha died, Sarah visited even more frequently. She'd bring groceries and cook dinner, filling the kitchen with the familiar sounds of pots clattering and onions sizzling. She'd sit with me on the porch afterward, both of us watching the lake and remembering the woman who had been the center of our world. "She was proud of you, you know," Sarah had said one evening, her voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "Mom always said you were the strongest man she'd ever known, not because you never bent, but because you always found a way to stand back up." I'd wanted to tell her that I felt anything but strong, that most days I could barely manage to get dressed and make coffee. But Sarah had this way of seeing strength where others saw only stubbornness, hope where others saw only habit. It was Martha's gift, passed down to the daughter who carried her mother's heart in her own gentle hands. 3 months ago, on a Tuesday that had started like any other, Sarah had called with news that changed everything. She'd been to the doctor about some persistent fatigue, some unexplained weight loss. The tests had revealed what we'd all secretly feared, but none of us had dared to speak aloud. The same cancer that had taken Martha was now growing inside our daughter. "Don't worry, Dad," she'd said, her voice steady in that brave way that reminded me so much of her mother. "We caught it early. Dr. Morrison says the treatment has a good success rate." But I'd heard the slight tremor beneath her calm words, had recognized the forced optimism that people wear like armor when they're facing the unthinkable. I'd worn that same armor during Martha's illness, had felt it crack a little more each day until it finally shattered completely. Sarah had been wrong about catching it early. The cancer was aggressive, spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 6 weeks, she was gone, leaving behind a hole in the world that felt larger than her small frame should have been able to create. The funeral had been packed. Sarah's students, past and present, filled the first 3 rows, their faces streaked with tears. Her fellow teachers spoke of her kindness, her patience, her unwavering belief that every child deserved to be seen and valued. The volunteers from the animal shelter shared stories of her gentle touch with frightened animals, her ability to coax trust from creatures that had forgotten how to hope. Michael had been there, of course, dressed in his finest black suit, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to public appearances. But I'd watched him during the service, seen the way his eyes drifted to his phone, the subtle impatience in his posture. He'd grieved, I was certain of that. Sarah was his sister, after all. But even in grief, he seemed to be calculating, measuring, planning his next move. During the reception afterward, I'd overheard him talking to someone about Sarah's modest savings account, the small life insurance policy she'd maintained, the few pieces of jewelry Martha had left her. At the time, I dismissed it as the natural concern of a surviving family member, the practical details that someone has to handle when death disrupts the careful order of life. I should have paid more attention. Now, sitting in the kitchen with my cooling coffee and the weight of too many memories, I found myself thinking about something Martha had said to me during her final days. We'd been sitting in the hospital room, watching Sarah doze in the uncomfortable chair she'd claimed as her own, when Martha had reached for my hand with fingers that felt as delicate as bird bones. "Promise me something, Harold," she'd whispered, her voice barely strong enough to carry across the space between us. "Promise me you'll make sure our children take care of each other. Don't let them drift apart like my brother and I did. Family is all we really have in the end." I'd promised, of course. I'd have promised her anything in that moment, would have moved mountains if she'd asked me to. But now, with both my wife and daughter gone, I was beginning to understand how difficult some promises are to keep. The mailbox at the end of our driveway had become a source of dread over the past few weeks, Bills and condolence cards had given way to legal documents and official correspondence that I didn't entirely understand. Martha had always handled the household finances, the insurance policies, the paperwork that seemed to multiply like weeds after someone dies. I'd tried to take care of things myself, but the language of lawyers and bureaucrats might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense it made to me. That's when Michael had stepped in, offering to help sort through the legal complexities of settling Sarah's estate. He'd been surprisingly gentle about it, patient with my confusion, reassuring in his competence. "Don't worry about any of this, Dad," he'd said, gathering the papers into neat stacks on the kitchen table where Sarah and I had once worked on her elementary school homework. "I'll take care of everything, you just focus on taking care of yourself." It had felt like a kindness then, a son finally stepping up to shoulder the burden his aging father couldn't carry alone. I'd signed the papers he'd brought me, trusted his explanations about probate procedures and estate taxes, grateful to have someone capable handling the details that made my head spin. But last week, something had begun to feel wrong. The house felt different somehow, heavier, as if the very walls were holding secrets they didn't want to share. I'd started paying more attention to the documents that arrived in the mail, trying to decode the legal jargon that Michael had assured me wasn't worth my concern. And yesterday, while cleaning out Sarah's old room, a task I'd been putting off for weeks, I'd found something that made my hands shake and my heart pound with a rhythm I hadn't felt since the war. Hidden in the back of Sarah's jewelry box, behind the pearl earrings Martha had given her for her 21st birthday, was an envelope addressed to me in Martha's careful handwriting. Inside, I'd found a letter dated just 2 weeks before Martha died, along with copies of legal documents I'd never seen before. The letter was brief, written in the shaky script of someone fighting both illness and time. "My dearest Harold, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and something has happened to our Sarah too. I pray this letter never sees daylight, but I know I need to be prepared for every possibility. I've made arrangements, sweetheart. The money from my mother's estate, the inheritance that was supposed to be split between the children, I've ensured it will go to Sarah if something happens to me first. She's the one who will need it most, who will use it for good things, for helping others. Michael has his career, his success. Sarah has only her generous heart and her teacher's salary. The papers are all filed with our lawyer, Mr. Davidson. Sarah doesn't know about this yet, but she will when the time comes. I've made you the executor, the one to ensure everything goes as it should. Please, Harold, don't let Michael's charm and competence make you forget what's right. He can be so persuasive when he wants something. I love you both so much. Take care of each other. Forever yours, Martha." I'd read the letter 3 times, each reading making the terrible truth clearer. Martha had known, even in her final days, that Michael might try to claim more than his share. She'd made provisions, legal protections, careful arrangements to ensure that Sarah would be taken care of. And somehow, those protections had failed. The documents I'd found with the letter painted a different picture than the one Michael had shown me. According to Martha's will, her real will, not the simplified version Michael had walked me through, Sarah was supposed to inherit the bulk of Martha's mother's estate, a sum that would have made her final months comfortable, maybe even allowed her to take time off work for treatment instead of pushing herself through chemo sessions between parent-teacher conferences. But Sarah had died believing she had nothing more than her small savings account and the modest life insurance policy she'd maintained. She'd never known about her mother's inheritance, had never received the financial security Martha had tried so hard to provide. The coffee in my cup had gone completely cold, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Outside, the garage stood exactly as it always had, but everything else in my world had shifted, tilted on its axis like a ship taking on water. My son, my successful, competent, trustworthy son, had stolen his dying sister's inheritance, and I had helped him do it by signing papers I didn't understand, trusting explanations I didn't verify, believing in a version of Michael that I now realized had been carefully constructed to hide the man he'd actually become. The morning sun had moved across the sky while I sat there, painting different shadows on the kitchen floor, marking the passage of time in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. This was still my kitchen, still my house, still my life. But the story I'd been telling myself about my family, about my son, had been revealed as nothing more than wishful thinking. I thought about Martha's letter, about her final request that I take care of our children, that I make sure they took care of each other. I thought about Sarah, dying with financial worries she should never have had to carry. I thought about Michael, probably sleeping peacefully in his expensive downtown condo, secure in the belief that his theft would never be discovered. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty, but expectant. Like the moment before a storm breaks, when even the birds stop singing and the world holds its breath. I reached for the phone with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. There were calls to make, questions to ask, truths to uncover. Martha had trusted me to protect our family's integrity, and I'd failed her once already. I wouldn't fail her again. The phone felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. Mr. Davidson's office wouldn't open for another 2 hours, but I found myself staring at his business card, the edges worn soft from years in Martha's address book, as if I could will the answers to appear before I had to ask the questions that would shatter what remained of my faith in my son. I made coffee instead, the ritual providing a temporary anchor in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. The familiar sounds, water filling the pot, the gentle gurgle of brewing, seemed amplified in the morning quiet. Everything felt too loud, too sharp, as if grief had stripped away some protective layer I hadn't known I possessed. The letter lay on the kitchen table where I had left it the night before. Martha's handwriting as clear and purposeful in death as it had been in life. I'd memorized every word by now, but I read it again anyway, searching for some alternative interpretation that would restore the son I thought I knew. He can be so persuasive when he wants something. Martha had written that line with such careful understatement, the kind of gentle criticism she'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. She'd never been one to speak harshly of anyone, especially not her own children. But I could see now what I'd missed then, the worry beneath her diplomatic words, the mother's intuition that had recognized something in Michael that I'd been too blind or too hopeful to acknowledge. The documents clipped behind her letter were dense with legal language, but certain phrases stood out like accusations. The sum of $347,000 from the estate of Eleanor Whitman, to be held in trust for Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, with Harold James Morrison as executor and primary trustee. My mother-in-law had been a frugal woman, saving every penny from her husband's railroad pension. I'd known she'd left something for the grandchildren, but I'd never imagined the amount was so substantial. $347,000, enough to have made Sarah's final months comfortable instead of desperate. Enough to have paid for the experimental treatment her insurance wouldn't cover. Enough to have given her hope instead of the quiet resignation I'd seen in her eyes during those last weeks. By 8:30, I couldn't wait any longer. I dialed Davidson's office, my fingers fumbling with numbers I'd known for 20 years. Morrison and Associates, how may I help you? The receptionist's voice was professionally cheerful, completely unaware that she was about to become part of my family's unraveling. This is Harold Morrison. I need to speak with Mr. Davidson about my wife's estate. It's urgent. There was a pause, the sound of pages turning. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but Mr. Davidson is in court this morning. Could I schedule you for this afternoon? Say, 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock felt like a lifetime away, but I agreed. What choice did I have? The truth had waited 18 months. It could wait a few more hours. The morning crawled by with the sluggish pace of a nightmare. I tried to keep busy, washing dishes that were already clean, straightening magazines that were already neat. But my mind kept returning to the same terrible arithmetic. $347,000 disappeared without a trace. Sarah's medical bills stacked on her kitchen counter like accusations. Michael's concerned explanations about simplified probate procedures and tax advantages. At 11, Michael called. Hey, Dad, just checking in. How are you doing today? His voice carried that careful tone people use when they're talking to the elderly or the fragile, a mixture of patience and barely concealed condescension. I'd grown accustomed to it over the past few months, had even been grateful for his attention. Now it sounded like the voice of a stranger. I'm fine, Michael. Just fine. Good. Listen, I wanted to let you know that the final paperwork on Sarah's estate should be ready next week. Just a few more signatures and everything will be wrapped up, nice and clean. Nice and clean. As if my daughter's life could be reduced to a filing system, her memory contained in a manila folder marked Case Closed. Michael, I had a question about the estate, about your grandmother's inheritance. The pause that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt loaded with significance. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, becoming more measured, more careful. "What about it, Dad? I thought we went over all of that. Remember? It was part of Mom's estate, passed down through the normal channels. Nothing complicated about it. But I thought, didn't your mother want Sarah to have something specific, something separate?" Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him thinking, calculating, choosing his words like a chess player, considering his next move. "Dad, you're getting confused again. We talked about this. Mom's estate was handled according to her will, the legal will that the court recognized. Everything was split equally between Sarah and me, just like it should have been. Sarah got her share, I got mine, fair and square. Fair and square." The phrase sat in my stomach like a stone. "I see," I said, though I didn't see anything except the growing certainty that my son was lying to me. "Look, I know this is hard. Losing Mom and then Sarah so close together, it would confuse anyone. Maybe we should talk about getting you some help around the house. Someone to help with the day-to-day stuff, keep track of things. Keep track of things, like a child who couldn't be trusted with his own affairs." "I'm fine, Michael. I can take care of myself." "Of course you can, Dad. Of course you can. I just want to make sure you're not worrying about things unnecessarily. All the legal stuff is handled. You don't need to think about any of it." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen's growing shadows and felt something harden inside my chest. It wasn't anger yet. That would come later. It was something colder and more resolute, like the moment in winter when water finally decides to become ice. Michael had lied to me, not just omitted details or simplified complex information, but deliberately, consciously lied. He'd looked me in the eye, or close enough to it over the phone, and constructed an elaborate fiction designed to cover his theft. And he'd done it with the kind of smooth competence that suggested this wasn't his first time. How many other lies had I accepted without question? How many times had his help actually been manipulation disguised as filial duty? The drive to Davidson's office felt like traveling through a foreign country, where all the landmarks had been rearranged. I'd been on these streets 1,000 times, but everything looked different now, seen through the lens of betrayal. Even the familiar downtown storefronts seemed somehow complicit, as if the whole world had been keeping secrets from me. Davidson's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had housed lawyers for as long as I could remember. The waiting room smelled of leather and old paper, a comforting scent that had always made me feel like I was in capable hands. Now it just reminded me of how much I didn't know about the legal machinery that had apparently been working against my family's interests. "Mr. Morrison." Davidson appeared in his doorway, looking exactly as he had for the past 20 years, rumpled but dignified, like a professor who'd slept in his office. "Please, come in." His office was a monument to organized chaos, papers stacked in towering piles that seemed to defy gravity. But I knew from experience that Davidson could locate any document within seconds, his system comprehensible only to himself. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, settling behind his desk. "Sarah was a lovely woman. Martha would have been so proud of the teacher she became." "Thank you, but actually, that's why I'm here, about Martha and Sarah, and some things I don't understand about their estates." Davidson's expression grew cautious. "What kind of things?" I pulled Martha's letter from my jacket pocket, my hands surprisingly steady. "I found this in Sarah's room, hidden in her jewelry box." Davidson took the letter, his eyes moving quickly across Martha's familiar handwriting. As he read, I watched his face change, saw the professional composure crack slightly around the edges. "Jesus," he whispered, then immediately apologized for the profanity. "I'm sorry, Harold, but this isn't what we handled. The will we probated didn't include any of these provisions." "What do you mean?" Davidson was already moving, pulling files from one of his impossible stacks. "Here, this is the will your son brought to us after Martha died. Very straightforward. Everything split equally between the children. Standard language, completely legitimate. But this letter?" He held up Martha's words like evidence in a trial. "This describes a completely different set of arrangements." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Are you saying there were two wills?" "I'm saying someone made sure I only saw one of them." Davidson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, the sound of a man realizing he'd been used. Harold, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did Martha ever mention making changes to her will? Anything about special provisions for Sarah? I closed my eyes, trying to reach back through the fog of grief and medication and endless hospital days. Martha had been so weak toward the end, her voice often barely audible above the hum of machines keeping her tethered to life. But yes, there had been something. She did mention it once, said she wanted to make sure Sarah would be taken care of, that she'd made some arrangements. But she was so sick, and there were so many doctors, so many decisions. I thought she was just worried, the way sick people worry about things. Davidson nodded grimly. Your son handled all the probate paperwork, brought us the will, filed the necessary documents, managed the entire process. Very efficient, very professional. We never had any reason to question his authority or the documents he provided. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Michael hadn't just stolen Sarah's inheritance. He'd orchestrated an elaborate deception, manipulating the legal system itself to cover his tracks. And he'd been so confident in his plan that he'd convinced the family lawyer to be an unwitting accomplice. Is there anything we can do? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Davidson was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers spread across his desk like a general surveying a battlefield. The probate process is closed. Sarah's estate has been settled according to the will we were given, without the original documents that Martha refers to in this letter, without proof that there was fraud involved. What kind of proof? The actual will she describes, bank records showing the segregated trust account, documentation of the specific bequests. He looked at me with something that might have been pity. Harold, your son is a smart man. If he planned this carefully, and it looks like he did, he would have made sure to eliminate any evidence that contradicted his version of events. I felt something break inside me, a fundamental belief in the fairness of the world that I'd carried since childhood. So he gets away with it. Sarah dies thinking she has nothing, and Michael walks away with money that was never his to take. I didn't say that. Davidson's voice carried a note of steel I hadn't heard before. I said it would be difficult, not impossible. If you're willing to fight, if you're prepared for what that might mean for your relationship with your son, then there are options. But, Harold, I have to warn you, this won't be easy. Michael has had months to cover his tracks, and he's clearly thought this through very carefully. What would I have to do? Davidson leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. We'd have to challenge the probate, claim fraud, demand a complete accounting of both estates. It would mean depositions, court hearings, public records. Your family's business would become a matter of legal record. And your son, he wouldn't take this quietly. He'd fight back, probably claim you're suffering from dementia or grief-induced confusion. It could get very ugly very quickly. I thought about Michael's phone call that morning, his casual suggestion that I might need help around the house. I thought about Sarah, worrying about medical bills while hundreds of thousands of dollars sat in an account she didn't even know existed. I thought about Martha's letter, her final request that I protect our children from each other. How long do I have to decide? Not long. There are statutes of limitations, procedural deadlines. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. I stood up, Martha's letter folded carefully in my jacket pocket. I need some time to think. Of course. But Harold? Davidson's voice stopped me at the door. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm sorry. If I'd been more careful, more suspicious of such a convenient set of documents, maybe this could have been prevented. The drive home passed in a blur of autumn colors and half-formed thoughts. The lake was choppy when I reached our street, white caps dancing across the surface under a gray sky that threatened rain. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house that had sheltered 4 generations of my family. Inside, I made dinner, a simple meal of grilled cheese and tomato soup that Martha used to prepare when I was feeling low. The kitchen felt enormous around me, too big for one person, too quiet for the conversations I needed to have with people who were no longer there. After I'd eaten, I walked out to the garage and stood among the accumulated artifacts of a life shared with others. The butterfly-decorated toy chest Sarah had loved, the red go-kart that had made Michael the envy of the neighborhood, projects completed and abandoned, dreams realized and deferred, all of it gathering dust in the fading light. I pulled out the wooden stool Martha used to sit on while I worked, positioned it next to my old workbench, and sat down to think. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust, familiar scents that had once brought comfort, but now seemed like relics from a simpler time when the worst problems could be fixed with the right tool and enough patience. On the workbench, pushed to the back, behind a coffee can full of screws, I found something I'd forgotten was there. A photograph of the four of us from Sarah's college graduation. We were standing in front of the campus library, Martha and I flanking our children, everyone smiling with the particular brightness that comes from shared achievement. Michael looked young in the photo, not yet hardened by whatever had turned him into someone who could steal from his dying sister. Sarah looked radiant, her teaching degree clutched in one hand, her other arm around her mother's waist. Martha looked proud, but tired. This would have been just before her first cancer scare, though we didn't know it then. And there I was, grinning like a man who believed his family would always be this happy, this intact, this honest with each other. I studied Michael's face in the photograph, searching for some early sign of the man he would become, but all I could see was my son, the boy I'd taught to fish and drive and change oil, the young man who'd hugged me fiercely when he left for college and promised to call every Sunday. When had he changed? When had success become more important than integrity? When had his sister's well-being become less valuable than his own financial gain? The sky was fully dark by the time I went back into the house. I made a cup of tea, Martha's evening ritual that I'd adopted in her absence, and sat at the kitchen table with her letter spread out before me. The words blurred slightly in the lamplight, but their meaning was crystal clear. Martha had known. Somehow, in her final days, she'd seen what I'd missed. She'd tried to protect Sarah, tried to ensure that her daughter would be cared for after she was gone, and she'd trusted me to make it happen. I'd failed her. Through ignorance, through misplaced trust in our son, through the simple exhaustion of grief, I'd let Michael manipulate both of us. I'd signed papers I didn't understand, accepted explanations that should have raised red flags, allowed myself to be managed like an incompetent child. But Martha's letter had found me, hidden in Sarah's jewelry box like a message in a bottle, washing up on shore just when I'd stopped looking for rescue. It was a second chance, an opportunity to honor the promise I'd made to my dying wife. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a home that had weathered decades of joy and sorrow, celebration and loss. Through the kitchen window, I could see the lake, its surface now calm under the starlit sky. Somewhere out there, in the depths where Martha and I had scattered rose petals on our anniversary every year, lay the dreams we'd shared for our children's future. I thought about Davidson's warnings, about the ugliness that lay ahead if I chose to fight. I thought about Michael's probable reaction, the accusations of senility and confusion that would follow any challenge to his carefully constructed deception. I thought about the family gatherings that would never be the same, the relationships that would be damaged beyond repair. But I also thought about Sarah, dying with worries she shouldn't have had to carry. I thought about Martha's trust, placed in me with her final breath. I thought about the difference between peace and surrender, between forgiveness and enabling. The tea in my cup had grown cold, but I barely noticed. My hands were steady now, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been since before Martha's diagnosis. The path ahead would be difficult, probably painful, certainly complicated. But for the first time in months, I knew exactly what I had to do. I reached for the phone and dialed Davidson's home number, which I found in Martha's address book under emergency contacts. Harold? His voice carried surprise and a note of concern. Is everything all right? I've made my decision, I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. About the estates, about the fraud. I want to fight this thing, whatever it takes. There was a pause, and then Davidson's voice came back, warm with approval. I was hoping you'd say that. When do you want to start? Tomorrow morning, first thing. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that extended beyond simply getting through another day. The battle ahead would test everything I thought I knew about family, about love, about the price of standing up for what's right. But Martha had been right about one thing in her letter. I was stronger than I looked, not because I never bent, but because I always found a way to stand back up. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of standing up for my daughter, for my wife, for the family integrity that Michael had tried so hard to destroy. Tonight, I would sleep better than I had in months. I woke before dawn with the kind of clarity that comes after a sleepless night spent making difficult decisions. The house felt different in the gray morning light, not empty anymore, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. I made coffee with hands that didn't shake, dressed in my best suit, the navy blue one Martha had bought me for Sarah's graduation, and prepared for war. Davidson had agreed to meet me at 8 o'clock, an hour before his office officially opened. "We'll need privacy for this," he'd said during our late-night phone call, "and time to prepare before the day gets away from us." I appreciated his discretion, though I suspected that by evening half the town would know that Harold Morrison was challenging his son's handling of the family estates. The drive downtown was peaceful, the streets mostly empty except for delivery trucks and early commuters. I'd made this same trip hundreds of times over the years, for house closings, will preparations, the mundane legal business that accumulates over a lifetime. But this morning felt different, charged with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Davidson was waiting for me in his office, 2 cups of coffee already steaming on his desk. He'd clearly been there for hours. Fresh stacks of papers covered every available surface, and his computer screen glowed with open documents. "I've been doing some research," he said without preamble, "looking into procedures for challenging closed probate cases, statutes of limitations, precedents for fraud claims. The good news is that we have options. The bad news is that none of them will be simple." I sat down across from his desk, noting how the morning light streaming through his windows made the whole office feel like a courtroom. "Tell me what we're up against." Davidson pulled a yellow legal pad from one of his stacks, his handwriting covering both sides in the dense scrawl of a man who'd been working through the night. "First, we need to establish that a different will existed, the one Martha references in her letter. Without that document, we're building a case on circumstantial evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "Bank records, for starters. If Martha set up a separate trust for Sarah, there should be a paper trail. Investment accounts, transfer records, communication with financial institutions. Your son couldn't have eliminated everything." Davidson flipped to the next page of his notes. "Second, we need to demonstrate that the will we probated wasn't Martha's final wishes. That means proving Michael had access to multiple documents and chose to file only the one that benefited him. And third is the hardest part. We need to show intent to defraud, that Michael knew he was submitting the wrong will, that he deliberately concealed the existence of the other document, that he acted with malicious intent rather than simple confusion or mistake." I thought about my phone conversation with Michael the day before, the smooth way he'd deflected my questions, the casual suggestion that I might be getting confused. There had been nothing simple or mistaken about his responses. "How do we start?" Davidson consulted his notes again. "We file a motion to reopen the probate proceedings, claiming newly discovered evidence of fraud. That gives us legal standing to demand document production, to subpoena bank records, to depose everyone involved in the original process." "Including Michael?" "Especially Michael." Davidson's expression was grim. "Harold, I need you to understand what this means. Your son will be forced to testify under oath about his handling of both estates. If we can prove he lied, we're not just talking about civil remedies. Probate fraud is a criminal offense." The weight of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd come here thinking about recovering Sarah's inheritance, about honoring Martha's wishes. I hadn't fully considered that I might be setting in motion events that could destroy my son's life entirely. "You're having second thoughts," Davidson observed. "Wouldn't you?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention I imagined he reserved for clients standing at the edge of life-changing decisions. "Harold, I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen families tear themselves apart over money, over pride, over ancient grudges that nobody even remembers starting. But I've also seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of clear wrongdoing. And the wrongdoing doesn't go away. It just gets easier the next time." I thought about that while Davidson gathered the papers we'd need for our first filing. Michael had pulled off this deception with remarkable skill, manipulating not just me, but the entire legal system. How long had he been planning it? Had he started laying groundwork even before Martha died, positioning himself to take advantage of her final illness? More disturbing. If he could steal from his dying sister, What else was he capable of? At 10 o'clock, Davidson filed our motion with the probate court. By 10:30, the clerk had scheduled a hearing for the following Wednesday. By 11, the process server was on his way to Michael's downtown office with official notice that his father was challenging his handling of the family estates. "How long before he calls?" I asked as we walked back to Davidson's office. "If I know your son, he'll call within the hour. The question is whether he comes at you with anger or concern. My guess is concern, at least at first. He'll want to gauge how much you actually know." Davidson was wrong about the timing. Michael called 45 minutes later, while I was still sitting in the law office reviewing the documents we'd filed. "Dad?" His voice carried a note of bewildered hurt that might have convinced me if I hadn't spent the morning learning about the legal consequences of probate fraud. "I just got served with some papers. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Michael. But I don't understand. These papers say you're challenging Mom's will, claiming there was fraud in the probate process. Dad, we went through everything together. You signed off on all the paperwork." The careful emphasis on those last words wasn't lost on me. Michael was already building his defense, establishing that I'd been a willing participant in the process I was now challenging. "I signed papers I didn't understand, Michael. Papers you told me were standard procedures. They were standard procedures. Everything we did was completely legal, completely by the book. I don't know what's gotten into you, but somebody's obviously been filling your head with crazy ideas. The only crazy idea I have is that my son might have stolen his sister's inheritance." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear Davidson's wall clock ticking in the background. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had changed, becoming cooler, more calculated. "Dad, I think you need to see a doctor. This kind of paranoid thinking, these false accusations, they're not normal. You've been under a lot of stress, losing Mom and then Sarah so close together. Maybe your judgment isn't as clear as it used to be." There it was, the accusation of mental incompetence that Davidson had predicted. Michael was moving quickly to establish an alternative narrative, one that painted me as a confused old man rather than a father seeking justice for his daughter. "My judgment is fine, Michael. Fine enough to find the letter your mother left, describing the real provisions she made for Sarah." Another pause, shorter this time, but somehow more ominous. "What letter?" "The one where she explains how she set up a trust for Sarah with $347,000 from her mother's estate. The one where she warns me not to let your charm and competence make me forget what's right." I heard Michael take a deep breath, then release it slowly. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Not the concerned son anymore, but something harder, more dangerous. "Dad, I don't know what you think you found, but I'm telling you this is a mistake. A big mistake. Those legal proceedings you've started, they're going to cost money. A lot of money. Money you don't have. And when this is all over, when you've embarrassed yourself and damaged our family's reputation, you're still going to be alone in that big house with nobody to take care of you." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Cooperate, or find yourself truly isolated. "Are you threatening me, Michael? I'm trying to protect you from lawyers who see a vulnerable old man and dollar signs, from a legal process that's going to eat up whatever savings you have left, from the kind of public humiliation that comes from making wild accusations you can't prove. Then you won't mind submitting to a deposition, under oath." "Dad, please, think about what you're doing. Think about what this is going to do to our family." Our family. As if he hadn't already destroyed it the moment he decided his sister's suffering was less important than his own financial gain. "I have thought about it, Michael. I have thought about very little else." "Then think about this. What if you're wrong? What if this letter you found isn't what you think it is? What if Mom was confused when she wrote it, or it was some kind of rough draft that never got implemented? You're about to drag our family through a very public, very expensive legal battle based on a piece of paper that might not mean anything at all." For a moment, doubt crept in. Martha had been very sick toward the end, sometimes confused about dates and details. What if the letter was just the confused rambling of a dying woman, a document with no legal standing? But then I remembered Davidson's research, the careful way Martha had dated and signed the letter, the specific details about account numbers and legal provisions. And I remembered Michael's smooth lies the day before, his immediate assumption that I was getting confused. If I'm wrong, Michael, then the court will determine that. If the letter doesn't mean anything, then you have nothing to worry about. And if you're right, what then? You think this is going to bring Sarah back? You think it's going to make you feel better about losing her? The cruelty of that question took my breath away. Michael was using my grief as a weapon, suggesting that my search for justice was just another symptom of an old man's inability to accept loss. This isn't about bringing Sarah back. It's about honoring your mother's wishes and making sure Sarah gets what was rightfully hers. Sarah's dead, Dad. Dead people don't need money. The casual dismissal in his voice, the complete absence of love or loss or regret, told me everything I needed to know about the man my son had become. You're right, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Sarah doesn't need the money, but justice isn't always about need, Michael. Sometimes it's about making sure the people who do wrong face consequences for their actions. Jesus Christ, Dad, listen to yourself. You sound like some vigilante from a bad movie. This is the real world. Sometimes things don't work out the way we'd like them to. Sometimes good people get dealt a bad hand. That doesn't mean somebody's to blame, and it doesn't mean you can fix it by destroying what's left of your family. I'm not destroying anything, Michael. I'm trying to rebuild it on a foundation of truth instead of lies. Truth? Michael's laugh was bitter, completely devoid of humor. You want truth? Here's truth. Sarah was broke when she died because she spent every penny she had on other people. Stray animals, struggling students, whatever charity case caught her attention that week. Even if she'd gotten this imaginary inheritance you're talking about, she would have given it all away within a year. At least this way, the money goes to someone who knows how to manage it responsibly. The breathtaking arrogance of that statement, the assumption that he had the right to make decisions about Sarah's money based on his judgment of her character, left me speechless for several seconds. That wasn't your decision to make, wasn't it? Someone had to be the adult in this family. Someone had to think practically about the future instead of just throwing money at every sob story that came along. Sarah was an adult, Michael. She had the right to spend her inheritance however she chose. And she chose to die without ever knowing about it. So what's the harm? The harm, as if the theft of $300,000 could be reduced to a philosophical question about trees falling in empty forests. The harm is that you lied to me, you manipulated legal documents, you stole money that wasn't yours to take. I protected family assets from being wasted. I ensured that Mom's legacy would be preserved instead of squandered. If that's stealing, then I'm guilty as charged. At least he'd stop pretending innocence. That was something. We'll let the court decide what you're guilty of, Michael. Fine. But Dad, when this is all over, when you've spent your retirement savings on legal fees and accomplished nothing except making yourself look foolish, don't come crying to me. I offered to help you today. I tried to protect you from your own bad judgment. After this, you're on your own. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in Davidson's office while the older man watched me with concerned eyes. Well, Davidson asked. He admitted it. Not in so many words, but he admitted taking the money. Said he was protecting family assets from being wasted. Davidson made a note on his legal pad. Did he make any threats? I thought about Michael's warnings about legal costs, about ending up alone with nobody to take care of me. Nothing specific, but the message was clear. Drop this or lose my son forever. And your response? I looked out Davidson's window at the busy street below, at the ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, while my world split apart along fault lines I'd never seen coming. In a few hours, word would spread through our small town that the Morrison family was tearing itself apart in court. There would be whispers and speculation, taking sides and judgment, but somewhere in the quiet spaces between what had been and what was coming, I could almost hear Martha's voice, steady and sure as it had been on our wedding day 43 years ago. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. I'd made promises to her that went deeper than the ones I'd made to our children, and those promises didn't end just because she had died. My response is that we press forward, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Davidson nodded, already reaching for his phone to begin the next phase of our legal assault. Then we'd better get started. Your son just declared war, Harold. Time to make sure we're ready to fight it. Outside, The autumn afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of day Martha had always loved. I thought about her letter, hidden for months in Sarah's jewelry box, waiting for the right moment to surface. Maybe she'd known this day would come, known that eventually I'd have to choose between keeping peace with my son and keeping faith with the truth. If so, she'd also known which choice I'd make. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since finding that letter, I felt like I was fighting for something worth the cost. Not just money, not even just justice, but the chance to honor the two women who'd made my life worth living. Michael had made his choice long ago, on some dark night when he'd decided his sister's welfare was less important than his own gain. Now, I was making mine. Let the consequences fall where they might. The whispers started at Murphy's hardware store on Thursday morning. I'd gone in to buy weather stripping for the back door, a small project to keep my hands busy while waiting for the legal machinery to grind into motion, when I noticed how the conversation at the counter stopped the moment I walked in. "Morning, Harold," Tom Murphy said, his usual cheerful greeting subdued. Behind him, two other customers suddenly became very interested in examining paint samples, their backs turned to me in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. I'd lived in this town for 47 years. I'd coached Little League with Tom's father, served on the church building committee with half the business owners on Main Street, attended more funerals and graduations and town meetings than I cared to count. But as I stood in that hardware store, trying to buy $15 worth of foam padding, I felt like a stranger in my own community. The phone calls had started Wednesday evening, just hours after news of the lawsuit began making its rounds. First came the cautious inquiries from well-meaning neighbors who'd heard something and wanted to make sure I was all right. Their concern felt genuine but careful, as if they were trying to gauge which side of the family dispute they should support before committing to anything more than surface sympathy. "Harold, dear, it's Betty Richardson from down the street. I just wanted to check on you. People are saying, well, they're saying all sorts of things. Is everything okay?" Betty had been Martha's bridge partner for 15 years. She'd brought casseroles after the funeral, helped me sort through Martha's clothes, listened patiently while I fumbled through the early stages of widowhood. But now, there was something strained in her voice, a distance that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine, Betty. Just trying to set some things right that should have been handled differently." "Oh, well, I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding. You know how legal things can get complicated. Maybe you should talk to Michael, work things out privately. Family disputes are so public once they get into the courts." Public. That was the word everyone seemed to dance around, as if the real crime wasn't stealing from a dying woman, but making the theft visible to the community. By Friday, the careful inquiries had been replaced by an even more telling response: silence. My mailbox, usually stuffed with church newsletters and community announcements, contained only bills and legal documents. The phone, which had rung regularly with invitations to potluck dinners and volunteer opportunities, fell quiet except for Davidson's updates on our case preparation. I'd become radioactive, a man whose family problems made others uncomfortable by association. The worst part was understanding why. Our town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and Michael had cultivated relationships here for decades. He'd sponsored the high school debate team, donated generously to the annual charity auction, served on the hospital board during its recent expansion campaign. His success reflected well on all of us. The local boy who'd made good in the big city, but never forgot where he came from. I, on the other hand, was just the retired father who'd lost his wife and daughter within 18 months, who now seemed to be lashing out at his only surviving child. The narrative practically wrote itself: grief-stricken old man versus successful son. Family loyalty versus the paranoid delusions of advanced age. Saturday morning, I decided to test that narrative at the place where town opinion was most likely to reveal itself. The diner on Elm Street where the coffee was terrible, but the gossip was reliably current. Marge's place had been the unofficial town hall for as long as I could remember. The same group of men gathered there every morning, retired farmers and shop owners, widowers and early risers who came as much for the company as the breakfast. I'd been part of that loose fraternity for years, contributing to conversations about weather and politics and the gradual decline of everything that had once made America great. When I pushed through the door at 7:30, the usual suspects were already settled into their regular booth. Frank Kowalski, who'd run the feed store until his son took over, Jim Porter, retired from the post office, Al Davidson, no relation to my lawyer, who'd taught mathematics at the high school for 38 years. They looked up when I entered, and I saw the moment of decision play out across their faces. Jim raised his hand in a brief wave, then turned back to his coffee. Frank managed a nod that could have meant anything. Al studied his newspaper with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for doctoral dissertations. I took a seat at the counter, ordered coffee and eggs from Marge herself, and waited to see if anyone would acknowledge the elephant that had apparently taken up residence in the middle of their morning routine. "Heard you had some excitement this week," Frank finally said, his tone carefully neutral. "Legal stuff?" "Some," I agreed. "Must be complicated getting all those estates sorted out. Lot of paperwork when someone dies." Frank was fishing, trying to get me to explain myself without having to ask direct questions. In the old days, before my family's business became the town's entertainment, he would have simply asked what the hell was going on and expected a straight answer. "It's not the paperwork that's complicated," I said. "It's what people do with it." Jim Porter looked up from his coffee. "Michael's always seemed like a straight shooter to me, very organized, very professional. Helped my daughter with some investment advice a few years back." The implied criticism was gentle but clear. Michael was the kind of man who helped neighbors with their financial planning, not the kind who would cheat his own family. Therefore, the problem must lie elsewhere. "People can surprise you," I said. "Sure can," Al Davidson agreed, but his tone suggested he was thinking about me rather than my son. The conversation died after that, killed by the weight of things nobody wanted to say directly. I finished my breakfast in a silence that felt more hostile than peaceful, paid my check, and left, without the usual round of goodbyes and see you tomorrows that had marked the end of countless similar mornings. Walking back to my car, I realized I'd just been given a preview of how the rest of this process would unfold. The town had chosen sides without waiting for evidence or testimony, or any of the inconvenient details that might complicate their preferred narrative. Michael was the success story, the proof that hard work and intelligence could lift someone above the limitations of small-town life. I was just the grieving father who couldn't accept that bad things sometimes happen to good people. The fact that the bad thing in question was theft rather than misfortune seemed irrelevant to people who valued social harmony more than inconvenient truth. Sunday was the hardest day. Martha and I had attended First Presbyterian for over 30 years, sitting in the same pew, participating in the same rituals, contributing to the same causes that kept the church functioning and the community connected. After Martha died, then Sarah, those Sunday mornings had become both more painful and more necessary. Painful because of the empty spaces beside me, necessary because they provided structure and human contact during the long weeks when grief made everything else feel pointless. I almost stayed home that morning, knowing what I was likely to encounter, but surrendering the church would feel like admitting defeat before the real battle had even begun. So I dressed in my good suit, drove to the familiar parking lot, and walked through doors I'd entered thousands of times before. The congregation's response was a masterclass in polite ostracism. People smiled and nodded, said hello when I greeted them first, went through all the motions of Christian fellowship. But the usual invitations to coffee hour were absent. The casual conversations that typically extended worship into the early afternoon were noticeably brief. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about forgiveness that felt pointed, though I couldn't be sure whether he was addressing me or the congregation that was so clearly struggling to know how to treat me. During the prayers for healing and guidance, I found myself wondering if anyone was praying for the truth to emerge, or if they all simply wanted this mess to disappear, so they could go back to their comfortable assumptions about family and loyalty and the proper way to handle private grievances. After the service, I was standing in the parking lot, keys in hand, when a voice called my name. "Mr. Morrison, Harold." I turned to find Jenny Carpenter, Sarah's former teaching assistant, approaching with the kind of determined stride that suggested she'd been working up courage for this conversation. "Jenny, how are you?" "I'm fine, but I wanted to ask about you. I've been hearing things about legal troubles with Michael, about Sarah's estate." Jenny was perhaps 25, young enough to speak directly instead of hiding behind the diplomatic language that seemed to paralyze everyone over 50. Her directness was refreshing after days of careful non-conversations. "People like to talk," I said carefully. "Mr. Morrison, I worked with Sarah for 3 years. I saw how she worried about money, especially during those last months when the medical bills kept piling up. She talked about taking a second job, about maybe moving to a smaller apartment. If there was money that should have gone to her." Jenny's voice trailed off, but her implication was clear. Here was someone who'd seen Sarah's struggles firsthand, who understood that my legal challenge wasn't about greed or family discord, but about justice for a woman who died thinking she was financially destitute. "I appreciate your concern, Jenny. Sarah was lucky to have friends like you. She was more than a colleague, Mr. Morrison. She was like an older sister to me. If someone took advantage of her, if someone let her suffer when they could have helped..." Jenny's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I just want you to know that not everyone thinks you're wrong to ask questions." It was the first real support I'd received since filing the lawsuit, and it meant more than I could express. But it also highlighted how isolated I'd become, that a 25-year-old teacher was the only person willing to publicly acknowledge that my actions might be justified. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." After Jenny walked away, I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the familiar patterns of post-church social interaction, groups forming and reforming around shared interests and old friendships, plans being made for afternoon visits and Tuesday night committees, the easy flow of community life continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, at least for me. I'd learned that loyalty in a small town could be as much about maintaining comfortable illusions as supporting truth. I discovered that success and charm could insulate someone from suspicion, even when their actions demanded scrutiny. Most painfully, I'd realized that grief didn't automatically generate sympathy if the grieving person insisted on asking uncomfortable questions. The drive home took me past the lake where Martha and I had spent so many peaceful evenings. The water was gray under the overcast sky, empty of the boats and swimmers that filled it during the warmer months. I pulled into our old picnic spot, turned off the engine, and sat watching the gentle waves lap against the shore. This was where Martha and I had talked through every major decision of our marriage: career changes, financial investments, the children's college choices, retirement plans. We'd brought our problems to this quiet place and sorted through them together, finding solutions that honored both our individual needs and our shared values. Now, I was facing the biggest decision of my life without her wisdom to guide me. The legal process Davidson had set in motion would continue whether I had community support or not. The depositions would happen, the evidence would be presented, the truth would emerge regardless of how many people preferred to look away. But the personal cost was becoming clearer with each passing day. I was 73 years old, recently widowed, estranged from my only surviving child. If I pursued this case to its conclusion, I might win justice for Sarah, but lose everything else that gave my life meaning and structure. Was it worth it? Was the principle of holding Michael accountable more important than the practical reality of spending my remaining years alone and bitter? Martha's voice seemed to whisper across the water, carrying words she'd spoken during another difficult time. "The right thing isn't always the easy thing, Harold, but it's still the right thing." I thought about Jenny Carpenter's tears, about Sarah's sleepless nights worrying over medical bills, about the letter Martha had hidden like a message for the future. I thought about Michael's casual dismissal of his sister's suffering, his assumption that he had the right to make decisions about money that wasn't his to control. The community might have chosen to look away, but I couldn't. Not if I wanted to live with myself for whatever years remained. I started the car and drove home, where Davidson's latest batch of legal documents waited on my kitchen table. There was work to do, evidence to gather, a case to build. The circle of silence around me might be growing wider, but inside that silence, the truth was still the truth. And truth, I was learning, was sometimes the only companion an old man really needed. Part 5. Gathering Evidence. The basement had always been Martha's domain, a carefully organized archive of our family's history that she'd maintained with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. Photo albums arranged by year, tax returns filed in chronological order, important documents sorted into labeled folders that made perfect sense to her, but had always seemed like an elaborate puzzle to me. Now, 3 weeks after filing the lawsuit, I found myself spending hours down there, searching through decades of accumulated paperwork for any trace of the inheritance that Martha had tried to secure for Sarah. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old paper, but I pressed on, driven by the growing certainty that somewhere in these boxes lay the proof I needed. Davidson had been specific about what we were looking for: bank statements showing unusual deposits or transfers, correspondence with financial institutions, any documentation of the trust account Martha had mentioned in her letter. Michael had been thorough in covering his tracks, but Davidson insisted that nobody could eliminate every piece of evidence without leaving some trace behind. Money leaves footprints, he'd said during our last meeting. The question is whether we can follow them back to their source. I'd started with Martha's personal files, the manila folders where she kept everything from warranty cards to Christmas card lists. Her handwriting appeared on dozens of documents, notes about insurance policies, reminders about investment accounts, careful records of charitable donations. Reading through them was like having a conversation with her ghost, hearing her voice in the precise way she documented every financial decision. In a folder marked Family Information, I found something that made my hands tremble: a photocopy of her mother's death certificate with a handwritten note in the margin. Trust account, First National Bank, account $4,77592, EW Estate Disbursement, July 2019. Eleanor Whitman, Martha's mother, had died in 2019, just 6 months before Martha's cancer diagnosis. I remembered the funeral, the small service at the Methodist church where Eleanor had worshipped for 60 years. But I didn't remember any discussion of a substantial inheritance, any mention of trust accounts or estate disbursements. Had Martha deliberately kept me ignorant of the money, wanting to handle it herself? Or had Michael already begun his manipulation, convincing her that I didn't need to know the details? I climbed the basement stairs with the document clutched in my hand, then called Davidson immediately. "That's exactly what we needed," he said, after I read him the account number. "I can subpoena those bank records now that we have specific information to request. Give me until tomorrow afternoon. I should have something by then." The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness. I tried to keep busy with household tasks, but every small sound, the mailman's truck, the neighbor's dog barking, the phone ringing with routine calls, sent my heart racing with anticipation. This account number might be the key that unlocked everything, or it might lead to another dead end in a case that was already consuming what remained of my retirement savings. Davidson called at 3 o'clock Tuesday with news that was both encouraging and infuriating. The account existed, he said without preamble. Eleanor Whitman's estate did make a deposit of $347,000 into a trust account at First National Bank on July 15, 2019. Martha was listed as the primary trustee, with specific instructions that the funds were to be held for Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. And the account was closed on October 3, 2023, 3 weeks after Martha died. All funds were transferred to a general estate account managed by Michael. The transfer was authorized by documentation showing that Martha's will designated him as executor of all estate matters, with full authority to consolidate accounts and distribute assets according to the will's provisions. I felt the familiar surge of anger that had become my constant companion over the past month. Michael hadn't just stolen the money. He'd done it with meticulous planning, using his authority as executor to legitimize what was essentially theft. Can we prove the transfer was fraudulent? That's where it gets interesting. The bank has copies of all the documentation Michael provided, including what appears to be Martha's will. But Harold, the will he showed them, isn't the same as the one we probated. What do you mean? Davidson's voice carried the excitement of a hunter who just found fresh tracks. The will he used to authorize the trust account transfer specifically mentions the $300,000 inheritance and designates him as having authority over it. But the will we probated, the one that went through the court system, doesn't mention that money at all. He had 2 different documents, and he used whichever one served his purposes at any given moment. The audacity of it took my breath away. Michael hadn't just found an opportunity and seized it. He'd created an elaborate scheme involving multiple false documents, carefully coordinated to give him legal cover for his theft. Does this prove fraud? It proves he had access to documents that weren't included in the official probate process. Whether that constitutes fraud depends on whether we can show he knew the documents were contradictory and chose to use them selectively. But, Harold, this is exactly the kind of evidence we needed. Your son made a mistake. He left a paper trail. Wednesday morning, I drove to First National Bank with Davidson and a court order requiring them to produce all records related to the trust account. The bank manager, a nervous young man who clearly wished he was anywhere else, led us to a conference room where boxes of photocopied documents waited. "We've pulled everything related to the account," he said, shuffling through papers with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was worried about liability. Initial setup, deposit records, correspondence, authorization forms, closure documentation. It's all here. Davidson dove into the papers with the focused intensity of an archaeologist uncovering artifacts. I sat beside him, watching him sort documents into piles, occasionally asking questions about dates or signatures or procedural details that meant nothing to me but seemed significant to him. After 2 hours, he sat back with a satisfied expression. "Look at this," he said, spreading 3 documents across the table. "Here's the original trust setup from July 2019, signed by Martha and witnessed by 2 bank employees. Here's the transfer authorization from October 2023, signed by Michael and referencing Martha's will. And here, this is the smoking gun, is a copy of that will." I studied the document he indicated, recognizing Martha's signature, but noticing subtle differences in the language and formatting. "This isn't the will we probated?" "Not even close. This version specifically mentions the trust account and gives Michael broad authority to manage it. The version that went through probate treats the inheritance as part of the general estate, to be split equally between the children. Your son had 2 wills, Harold, one for the bank, one for the court." "How is that possible?" Davidson's expression was grim. "It's possible because Martha was very sick when these were drafted, and probably wasn't thinking clearly about the legal implications of having multiple versions. Michael had access to her papers, her computer, probably even her passwords. He could have created whatever documents he needed." The bank manager, who'd been listening to our conversation with growing alarm, cleared his throat. "If there are questions about the validity of the documents we relied on—" "Your bank acted in good faith," Davidson assured him. "You had what appeared to be proper authorization. The fraud occurred before the documents reached you." Driving home from the bank, I felt a mixture of vindication and overwhelming sadness. We had the evidence we needed to prove Michael's deception, but that evidence painted a picture of systematic manipulation that went far beyond simple greed. He'd exploited Martha's illness, taken advantage of her trust, constructed an elaborate scheme to steal from his dying sister. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was calculated, premeditated theft from the people who should have been able to trust him most. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with the bank documents spread across the table, trying to reconcile the evidence of Michael's crimes with my memories of the boy I'd raised. When had he changed? When had success become more important than integrity? When had his family become nothing more than obstacles to his financial advancement? The phone rang at 8 o'clock. Michael's number appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won out over anger. I wanted to hear what he'd say, now that his carefully constructed lies were unraveling. "Dad, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I want to apologize. I said some things I shouldn't have said." His tone was conciliatory, the voice of a son reaching out to repair a damaged relationship. If I hadn't spent the day uncovering evidence of his fraud, I might have been touched by what sounded like genuine remorse. "What kinds of things?" "The suggestion that you might be confused, for one. That was out of line. You're obviously upset about this whole situation, and you have every right to be. Losing Mom and Sarah so close together, it would be hard for anyone." Michael was being careful now, trying to rebuild bridges he'd burned during our previous conversation, but his apology felt calculated, designed to extract information rather than express genuine regret. "I appreciate that," I said neutrally. "The thing is, Dad, I've been talking to some people, lawyers, financial advisors, people who understand these kinds of family disputes, and they're all telling me the same thing. This lawsuit is going to be expensive and time-consuming, and the odds of recovering any significant money are pretty slim." Is that right? The legal fees alone could eat up most of your savings. And even if you win, which is a big if, you'd be winning money that would just sit in an account somewhere. It's not like Sarah's coming back to enjoy it. There was the Michael I'd come to know, the one who reduced his sister's life to a cost-benefit analysis, who saw human relationships as transactions to be optimized. What's your point, Michael? My point is that maybe we can work something out. A settlement that gives you what you're really looking for without putting either of us through the expense and embarrassment of a public trial. A settlement. Now that the evidence was mounting against him, Michael wanted to negotiate his way out of consequences. What kind of settlement? Well, I've been thinking, what if I made a donation to Sarah's favorite charity, say, the animal shelter where she volunteered? Something substantial, something that would honor her memory in a meaningful way. That way, the money would go towards something she cared about, and we could avoid all this legal unpleasantness. The audacity of the proposal left me speechless for several seconds. Michael was offering to return a fraction of what he'd stolen, packaging it as charity to make himself look generous while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. How much of a donation? I was thinking 50,000, maybe 75 if we can wrap this up quickly. 75,000 out of 347,000. Less than a quarter of what he'd stolen, offered as if it were a magnanimous gesture rather than inadequate restitution. That's very generous of you, Michael. I think so too. And Dad, this way we could put all this behind us. Go back to being a family instead of adversaries in some legal battle that's just gonna make everyone miserable. I'll think about it, I said, though I'd already made my decision. Don't think too long. My lawyers tell me that the longer this drags on, the harder it becomes to reach a reasonable settlement. Positions get entrenched, emotions get involved. Better to handle it now while we can still be rational about everything. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and marveled at Michael's ability to reframe reality to suit his purposes. In his version of events, I was the one being unreasonable by refusing to accept his theft. He was the rational actor, offering compromise and seeking family harmony. The fact that his compromise involved keeping 75% of the money he'd stolen was apparently irrelevant. I called Davidson immediately and told him about the settlement offer. Interesting, he said after I'd finished. $75,000 on a $300,000 theft. That tells us two things. First, he's worried about what we're going to find in discovery. Second, he's still hoping he can manipulate you into accepting a fraction of what Sarah was owed. What do? We keep building the case. Tomorrow I'm deposing the bank employees who witnessed Martha's original trust setup. Friday, we're interviewing the lawyer who drafted her real will, the one Michael chose not to probate. By next week, we should have enough evidence to not only win the civil case, but to refer this to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known this was always a possibility. My son, my only surviving child, could end up in prison because of the case I'd initiated. Harold, you still there? I'm here, just thinking about what this means. I know it's hard, but remember why we started this. Sarah died thinking she was broke while $300,000 sat in an account she didn't even know existed. That's not just theft, Harold. That's cruelty. After I hung up, I walked out to the garage and stood among the accumulated artifacts of my family's history. The butterfly-decorated toy chest Sarah had loved. The red go-kart that had made Michael the envy of the neighborhood. Projects completed and abandoned. Dreams realized and deferred. Somewhere along the way, the boy who'd raced that go-kart with such joy had become a man who could steal from his dying sister without apparent remorse. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, imperceptible, like rust eating away at metal, until only the appearance of strength remained. But understanding how it happened didn't change what needed to be done. Sarah deserved justice. Martha deserved to have her final wishes honored, and I deserved to look at myself in the mirror without seeing a man who'd been too weak or too blind to protect the people he loved most. The evidence was mounting, the case was strengthening, and the truth was finally emerging from the shadows where Michael had tried to hide it. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The recorder sat on my kitchen table like a small silver accusation. Davidson had given it to me the previous Friday with specific instructions. If Michael calls again with settlement offers or threats, record everything. His own words will be our strongest evidence of consciousness of guilt. I'd been staring at the device for 20 minutes, coffee growing cold in my cup, while I wrestled with the ethical implications of secretly recording my own son. Martha would have been horrified at the idea. She'd always believed that family problems should be solved through honest conversation, not legal subterfuge. But Martha had also believed that our children would never deliberately hurt each other, and that faith had proven tragically misplaced. The past week had been a whirlwind of depositions and document reviews that were slowly painting a complete picture of Michael's deception. The bank employees who'd witnessed Martha's original trust setup confirmed that she'd been coherent and specific about her intentions. The money was for Sarah, held in trust until Martha's death, then to be distributed according to her final wishes. The lawyer who drafted Martha's actual will, a man named Peterson, whom Michael had apparently convinced me to avoid during the probate process, was even more damning in his testimony. He'd prepared documents that explicitly protected Sarah's inheritance, complete with safeguards against exactly the kind of manipulation Michael had later employed. Mrs. Morrison was very concerned about family dynamics, Peterson had told us during his deposition. She specifically mentioned that one of her children was very persuasive and might try to influence the distribution of assets. That's why we created the trust structure, to ensure her wishes couldn't be overridden by family pressure or legal maneuvering. But perhaps the most devastating evidence had come from an unexpected source, Michael's own computer records, subpoenaed as part of the discovery process. Hidden in his email archives, we'd found correspondence with a document service company that specialized in creating estate planning materials for clients who needed them, quickly and discreetly. The emails were coded but clear enough. Michael had paid $1,500 for a will that matched Martha's signature style and included language giving him broad authority over the trust account. The document was dated 3 days after Martha's death, but backdated to appear as if it had been executed 6 months earlier. He hadn't just found an opportunity to steal, he'd manufactured the legal justification for theft through sophisticated forgery. Davidson's strategy was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence we uncovered. Rather than simply demanding the return of Sarah's money, we were building a criminal case that could result in felony charges for forgery, fraud, and theft from an estate. Michael's settlement offers were no longer relevant. This had moved beyond civil dispute into criminal territory. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock, as if Michael had been watching the clock. I pressed the record button and answered on the third ring. "Dad, I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all. I've been up for hours." Good, good. Listen, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about a settlement. Have you given any more thought to my offer?" Michael's tone was carefully controlled, professional but warm, the voice of a successful businessman who was used to negotiating deals and finding mutually beneficial solutions. "I've thought about it," I said truthfully, "and I hope you can see that what I'm proposing makes sense for everyone involved. A clean resolution that honors Sarah's memory without dragging the family through an expensive and public legal battle. Michael, I have a question for you." "Of course. What is it?" "The will that went through probate. The one that split everything equally between you and Sarah. Did you draft that yourself?" The pause that followed was brief but telling. "Dad, I don't understand what you're asking. The will was Mom's will, prepared by her lawyer according to her wishes." "Which lawyer?" "The family lawyer. You know, the one we've always used." "But we'd never had a family lawyer. Martha and I had used different attorneys for different purposes over the years. Peterson for estate planning, Davidson for real estate transactions, others for specific legal needs. Michael was being deliberately vague, hoping I wouldn't press for details. "What was his name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, I don't think this kind of detailed discussion is productive. The important thing is that we follow Mom's wishes, which were clearly documented in the will that went through the proper legal channels. The will that Peterson never saw, even though he'd been working with your mother on estate planning for months before she died." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 10 seconds. When Michael finally spoke, his voice had changed, becoming cooler and more cautious. "I think someone's been filling your head with incorrect information. Mom used different lawyers for different purposes. It's not unusual for estate documents to be prepared by someone other than the attorney who handled previous matters." "Is that what happened, Michael? She used a different lawyer?" Dad, I can hear in your voice that you're upset about something. Maybe we should meet in person, sit down, and talk through whatever concerns you have. This kind of conversation is better handled face to face. Michael was trying to regain control of the conversation, to move it away from specific questions about documents and lawyers toward the kind of emotional manipulation he'd always been skilled at. But I'd learned to recognize his techniques now, could hear the calculated concern beneath his words. I'm not upset, Michael. I'm just trying to understand how things were handled. Everything was handled properly, Dad. Completely properly. If you're hearing suggestions otherwise, then someone is deliberately trying to create problems where none exist. Who would do that? I don't know. Maybe lawyers who see a chance to generate fees by creating unnecessary litigation. Maybe people who have their own grievances against our family. The point is that there are always people willing to exploit a grieving father's confusion for their own benefit. There it was again. The suggestion that I was confused, that my questions were the product of grief-induced paranoia rather than legitimate concerns about documented fraud. Michael, I found some papers in Sarah's room, papers that suggest the inheritance was supposed to be handled differently. What kind of papers? His voice had sharpened slightly, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. This was the question he'd been dreading, the moment when he'd have to confront the existence of evidence he thought he'd successfully hidden. A letter from your mother, explaining how she'd set up a trust account for Sarah with money from your grandmother's estate. Dad? Michael's voice carried a note of sadness that sounded almost genuine. I hate to say this, but Mom was very sick toward the end. Sometimes she got confused about things, wrote down ideas that weren't actually implemented. You can't base legal decisions on every note or letter she might have written during that difficult time. This letter was very specific, Michael. Account numbers, exact amounts, detailed instructions. Confused people can be very specific about their confusion. That doesn't make it real. The casual dismissal of Martha's mental state, the suggestion that her final wishes could be ignored as the ravings of a sick woman, triggered a surge of anger that I struggled to keep out of my voice. Your mother wasn't confused when she wrote that letter. She was protecting Sarah from exactly what ended up happening. Dad, please, listen to yourself. You're talking about conspiracy theories, about Mom somehow knowing the future and making secret plans. That's not rational thinking. What's not rational is a $300,000 inheritance disappearing without explanation. Nothing disappeared. The inheritance was handled exactly according to Mom's legal will. If there was additional money that you think should have gone to Sarah, then show me the legal documents, not confused letters or random notes, but actual legal documents that would stand up in court. Michael was betting that such documents didn't exist, that Martha's illness had prevented her from properly finalizing the trust arrangements she'd described in her letter. But he was wrong, and he was about to find out how wrong. Actually, Michael, we have found legal documents, bank records, trust agreements, the original will that Peterson prepared, documents that show exactly what your mother intended, and exactly what you did to circumvent her wishes. The silence that followed was the longest yet. I could almost hear Michael's mind working, calculating how much I might know, how much evidence I might have, how much legal jeopardy he was facing. Dad, I think we need to end this conversation. It's clear that someone has been poisoning your mind against me, filling you with false information and legal theories that don't hold water. I offered you a generous settlement because I care about our family relationship, not because I've done anything wrong. What if I told you that the bank has records of you closing Sarah's trust account 3 weeks after your mother died? What if I told you that you used a forged will to authorize that transfer? I'd tell you that's impossible, because no such thing happened, and I'd strongly advise you to be very careful about making accusations like that, because false claims of criminal activity can have serious legal consequences for the person making them. Now Michael was threatening me, warning me about the legal dangers of accusing him of crimes. But his denials were becoming less convincing, more desperate. He knew the evidence existed. He was just hoping I didn't have access to it. Michael, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you take money that was intended for Sarah? I executed Mom's estate according to her legal will, as filed with the probate court and approved by a judge. Every penny was distributed according to law. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I'm going to give. Dad, I'm hanging up now. If you want to continue this conversation, you can have your lawyer call my lawyer. but I'm done being accused of crimes I didn't commit by a father who's been manipulated into believing stories that aren't true. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the still running recorder and the weight of what I'd just heard. Michael hadn't admitted guilt directly, but his evasions and threats told their own story. He was scared, cornered, running out of options. I called Davidson immediately and played him the recording. "Perfect," he said, after listening to the entire conversation. "He's trying to discredit the evidence before it's even presented, suggesting that you're confused and manipulated. That's consciousness of guilt behavior. Innocent people don't typically spend so much energy explaining why evidence against them shouldn't be believed. What happens now? Now we finish building the case. I've got one more deposition scheduled for next week. The document service company that created the forged will. After that, we'll have everything we need to present to the district attorney. And Michael's about to learn that theft is theft, regardless of family relationships. The amount involved puts this in felony territory, Harold. He's looking at serious prison time if convicted." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to imagine what the next few months would bring. Court hearings where my son's crimes would be laid bare for public scrutiny, newspaper articles about family betrayal and inheritance fraud, a community that had already chosen sides watching as their preferred narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence. And at the end of it all, justice for Sarah, but no family left to share it with. The recorder still sat on the table, its red light dark now, but the conversation it had captured would become evidence in a criminal case against my only surviving child. Martha had asked me to make sure our children took care of each other, but she'd never imagined that one of them would need protection from the other. Outside, the autumn evening was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that had always made Martha want to take long walks around the lake. I thought about her letter, hidden in Sarah's jewelry box for months, waiting for the right moment to surface and reveal the truth. Maybe she'd known this day would come, knowing that eventually I'd have to choose between protecting Michael from the consequences of his actions and protecting the integrity of the family she'd loved so deeply. The choice was made now, recorded and documented and moving inexorably toward its conclusion. Michael had taken everything from his sister's inheritance, but he wouldn't get away with it. The silence in the house felt different tonight, not empty, but patient. Like the moment before justice finally tips the scales back toward balance. Tomorrow, I would deliver the recording to Davidson and let the legal process take its final steps. Tonight, I would sit in Martha's kitchen and remember the woman who'd trusted me to do the right thing, even when the right thing meant breaking what remained of our family apart. Some promises I was learning were worth keeping regardless of the cost. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they had 30 years ago, when I'd climbed them for Sarah's adoption, a formality for what we already felt. Today they led to a hearing that would decide if my son would face charges for stealing from the sister he should have protected. Davidson walked beside me, briefcase in hand, full of evidence we'd gathered, bank records, forged documents, witness testimony. It was both reassuring and devastating, proof that justice was possible, but costly. "Remember," Davidson said as we approached the courthouse entrance, "this isn't a trial. It's a preliminary hearing to determine whether there's probable cause for criminal charges. The standard is lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, but the consequences are just as real." Inside, the courthouse bustled with the familiar chaos of the legal system, lawyers huddling with clients, court reporters setting up equipment, families gathered in small clusters that radiated either hope or despair. I recognized several faces from around town, people who'd come to witness the Morrison family's public unraveling. Michael was already seated at the defendant's table with his attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from the city who'd arrived the previous week with a reputation for defending white-collar criminals. He'd traded his usual business casual for a conservative dark suit that made him look younger, more vulnerable. When he caught sight of me entering the courtroom, his expression flickered between anger and something that might have been pleading. For a moment, I remembered the boy who scraped his knee learning to ride, who cried over nightmares. The contrast with the man accused of robbing his dying sister took my breath away. All rise, the Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding. Judge Hendricks was a woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for fairness, tempered with intolerance for legal games. She'd grown up in our county, understood the dynamics of small-town families, but had spent enough years on the bench to recognize when family loyalty was being used to cover criminal behavior. "We're here today," she began after settling into her chair, to determine whether there's probable cause to believe that Michael James Morrison committed theft by deception, forgery, and fraud in the administration of family estates. Mr. Davidson, you may present your evidence. What followed was a methodical dissection of Michael's crimes, laid out in chronological order with the precision of a medical examiner documenting cause of death. Davidson presented bank records showing the original trust account, Martha's letter explaining her intentions, the forged will Michael had used to authorize the illegal transfer. Each piece of evidence was devastating in its own way, but together they painted a picture of calculated deception that spanned months. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was systematic theft carried out by someone who'd carefully studied the legal system and exploited its weaknesses. The most damaging testimony came from Janet Williams, the document service employee who'd helped Michael create the forged will. Her voice shook as she described the specific requests he'd made. A document that matched Martha Morrison's signature style, included language about trust account authority, and was formatted to look like legitimate legal work. He said it was for a family situation where the original will had been lost, Williams testified. He seemed very knowledgeable about legal procedures, very confident about what he needed. I didn't think to question whether he had legitimate authority to request such documents. Michael's lawyer claimed Williams's company operated in a gray area, but Davidson showed that Michael had clearly crossed into forgery. When the defense spoke, the strategy shifted. Michael, she said, believed he was carrying out Martha's wishes. The differing documents showed a sick woman's indecision, not fraud. My client didn't steal anything, she told the judge. He administered an estate according to legal documents that were presented to him by the deceased. If there was confusion about Mrs. Morrison's final intentions, that's a civil matter for probate court, not a criminal matter for this courtroom. It was a clever argument, one that painted Michael as a dutiful son rather than a calculating thief. But it crumbled when Davidson played the recording of our final phone conversation, where Michael's own words revealed his knowledge of the trust account and his deliberate decision to circumvent Martha's documented intentions. Judge Hendricks listened to the entire recording with an expression that grew more stern with each evasion and threat. When it finished, she turned to Michael's attorney with barely concealed irritation. Counselor, your client's recorded statements clearly indicate knowledge of the trust arrangement and deliberate steps to circumvent it. This isn't confusion about an elderly woman's wishes. This is conscious decision-making to benefit himself at his sister's expense. The hearing lasted 3 hours, but the outcome was clear long before Judge Hendricks rendered her decision. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern of deception undeniable. Michael had committed serious crimes, and the legal system was going to hold him accountable. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Hendricks announced, I find probable cause to believe that the defendant committed theft in the first degree, forgery in the second degree, and fraud in the administration of an estate. Mr. Morrison will be bound over for trial, with arraignment scheduled for next month. The gavel's bang seemed to echo longer than it should have, marking the moment when my son officially became a criminal defendant facing years in prison. Around me, I could hear the rustle of reporters making notes, spectators whispering to each other, the machinery of justice grinding forward with inexorable momentum. Michael's face had gone pale during the judge's recitation of charges. When she finished, he turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger, certainly, but also something that might have been disbelief that his own father had brought him to this point. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us with questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Davidson handled most of them with the kind of diplomatic non-responses that lawyers perfect over decades of practice. But one young woman from the local newspaper pushed through the crowd with a question directed specifically at me. Mr. Morrison, how does it feel to know that your son could go to prison because of your lawsuit? The question hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the full implications of what I'd set in motion. Michael would likely be convicted. The evidence was too strong, his crimes too clear. He could spend the next 5 to 10 years in prison, emerging as a middle-aged felon with limited prospects and a destroyed reputation. It feels, I said carefully, like justice for my daughter and my wife, who trusted that their family would protect them instead of exploiting them. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of whiskey Martha had given me for my 70th birthday, still unopened until tonight. The house felt different somehow, not empty the way it had been since Martha and Sarah died, but hollow in a new way. Justice had been served, but it had cost me the last remaining member of my immediate family. The phone had rung several times during the afternoon, but I'd let the machine pick up. Reporters wanting follow-up quotes, neighbors offering support or criticism, acquaintances who'd suddenly remembered my existence now that my family's problems had become public entertainment. Only one call had mattered: Jenny Carpenter, Sarah's former teaching assistant, who'd left a message that brought tears to my eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted you to know that some of Sarah's friends are setting up a memorial fund with the money that gets recovered from the lawsuit. We're going to use it for a scholarship program, helping kids who can't afford school supplies and activities. Sarah would have loved that. She would have been proud of you for fighting for what was right." A scholarship fund. Sarah's money now helping children, the way she would have wanted. It wouldn't bring her back or restore the family Martha had once hoped for, but it was something good pulled from the wreckage of betrayal. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey and stepped onto the back porch. The lake stretched into darkness. Martha and I had spent countless evenings here, solving problems, celebrating, or simply sharing the quiet rhythm of a long marriage. Tonight, I felt her more strongly than I had since she died. Not as a ghost, but as conscience. The steady voice that guided me through the hardest decision of my life. She'd trusted me to protect our family's integrity, and I had, even when doing so meant destroying what little family remained. Michael would face trial in a few months. He'd likely plead to lesser charges, serve time in a white-collar facility, and one day walk free, angry, blaming me for his fall rather than owning his betrayal. There would be no more easy conversations between us, no shared holidays or milestones. The son I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man who valued money over his sister's memory, who exploited his parents' trust for profit. But Sarah's name was clear now, honored by truth instead of buried under lies. Martha's final wishes were fulfilled. The court had acknowledged what she always feared. Our daughter had been stolen from, not just forgotten. The whiskey burned going down, but it warmed something long frozen inside me. Justice didn't fix what was broken or bring anyone back, but it was clean, something silence and compromise could never offer. Tomorrow would bring more lawyers, reporters, and neighbors, some calling me brave, others cruel. The fund would need setting up. Sarah's legacy would live on, finally preserved. Tonight, I'd sit here and remember the family we once were, before cancer, greed, and ambition tore it apart. I'd drink Martha's whiskey and listen to the lake, not grieving, but steady. The silence was no longer hollow. It was earned. The battle was over. Justice had been done. The Morrison family was gone, but the Morrison name would be remembered, for truth, not betrayal. In the end, that would have to be enough.